The funeral of billionaire Elias Grant was moments away from ending when a black janitor burst through the crowd, his voice shattering the silence. "He's not dead! Stop the burial!" Security guards rushed toward him, grabbing his arms and forcing him to his knees. But even as they pinned him down, the man pointed a trembling finger at the mahogany coffin. "That man is being buried alive! This is murder!" The crowd froze, cameras stopped flashing, and for the first time, doubt crept into the eyes of everyone watching. 3 days earlier, Elias Grant had been the most powerful man in Silicon Valley. The founder of Grant Technologies, a software empire worth tens of billions of dollars, he had graced the covers of Forbes and Time more times than anyone could count. Politicians sought his endorsement. CEOs begged for his advice. His name alone could move stock markets. Now he lay in a mahogany coffin lined with white silk, his face pale and peaceful, as if death had finally given him the rest that life never could. The funeral was held at Greenwood Memorial Cemetery, the most prestigious burial ground on the West Coast. Hundreds of guests filled the outdoor pavilion, their black suits and designer dresses forming a sea of mourning. Senators sat beside tech moguls. Hollywood celebrities dabbed their eyes next to Wall Street executives. Television cameras lined the perimeter, broadcasting the event to millions of viewers worldwide. At the front of the gathering stood Randy Grant, Elias's only son and sole heir. At 42 years old, Randy had spent his entire life in his father's shadow, never quite measuring up to the impossible standards the old man had set. He delivered the eulogy with tears streaming down his cheeks, his voice cracking at all the right moments. "My father was more than a businessman," Randy said, gripping the podium. "He was a visionary, a pioneer, and to me, he was everything." The crowd nodded sympathetically. Women wiped their tears. Men bowed their heads in respect. But not everyone was watching Randy. Near the back of the cemetery, hidden among the gardening equipment and maintenance sheds, a man in a faded gray janitor's uniform watched the proceedings with haunted eyes. His name was Jamal Turner, and he had worked at Greenwood Memorial for the past 7 years. At 45, life had carved deep lines into his dark skin, each one a testament to struggles that most of these wealthy mourners could never imagine. Jamal had once been somebody. He had enlisted in the United States Army at 18 and served as a combat medic for 8 years, saving lives on battlefields half a world away. He had been good at it, too. His hands had been steady, his mind sharp, his courage unquestionable. But war had a way of breaking even the strongest men, and Jamal had come home with invisible wounds that no medal could heal. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. Jobs were scarce for veterans with nightmares. For the first 5 years after his discharge, Jamal drifted from one position to another, working construction, driving trucks, doing security work at nightclubs. Nothing stuck. His marriage had survived those difficult years, but barely. Then he had found steady work at Greenwood Memorial, a job that asked little of him and allowed him to fade into the background. 3 years ago, cancer had taken his wife Sarah, leaving him alone with their teenage daughter and a mountain of medical debt. Now Jamal pushed mops and emptied trash cans at a cemetery, invisible to the wealthy families who buried their loved ones here. He earned minimum wage, lived in a cramped apartment on the wrong side of town, and counted every dollar to make sure his daughter Rachel could someday go to college. It was a small life, a quiet life, the kind of life where you kept your head down and didn't make waves. But last night, everything had changed. Jamal's hands trembled as he remembered what he had witnessed. He had been working the late shift, preparing the grounds for today's funeral. Around 2 in the morning, he had heard voices coming from the mortuary building where Elias Grant's body was being kept. Curious, he had crept closer, staying in the shadows. Through a crack in the door, he had seen 2 men standing over the open coffin. One was Randy Grant. The other was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Jamal recognized him as Dr. Vincent Shaw, the Grant family's personal physician for the past 15 years. It was Dr. Shaw who had signed Elias Grant's death certificate, declaring the cause of death as a sudden heart attack. The dosage was perfect, Dr. Shaw had said, checking Elias's vital signs with clinical detachment. Tetrodotoxin. It slows the heart rate to nearly undetectable levels. To any normal examination, he appears completely dead. Randy had paced nervously beside the coffin. And you're certain he won't wake up during the funeral? That would be rather inconvenient. Dr. Shaw had smiled coldly. He'll remain in this state for approximately 72 hours. After that, without the antidote, his brain will be permanently deprived of oxygen. He'll be dead for real, and no autopsy will ever find anything suspicious. Good. Randy had stopped pacing, his grief-stricken public persona replaced by something hard and calculating. The old man was planning to change his will. Did you know that? 80% of his fortune was going to some charity for underprivileged children. He was going to leave me with scraps after everything I've sacrificed. The new will was scheduled to be signed next week, Dr. Shaw had confirmed. But now, as his only living heir, you'll inherit everything. Randy had laughed, a sound utterly devoid of warmth. Grant Technologies will finally be mine, as it always should have been. What about the antidote? Dr. Shaw had asked, holding up a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. Destroy it. No one can ever know this exists. Jamal had backed away slowly, his heart pounding so loud he was certain they would hear it. His foot had caught on a bucket, sending it clattering across the floor. The two men had spun around, their eyes scanning the darkness. Jamal had pressed himself against the wall, barely breathing. After an eternity, Randy and Dr. Shaw had dismissed the noise and returned to their conversation. When they finally left the building, Jamal had remained frozen in place for another 10 minutes. Only when he was certain they were gone did he move, and that's when he saw it. There, on the floor near the doorway, was a small glass vial. It must have fallen from Dr. Shaw's pocket during their hasty departure. Jamal had picked it up, reading the handwritten label. Tetrodotoxin antidote. His hands had shaken as he slipped the vial into his pocket. For hours afterward, he had wandered the cemetery grounds, his mind racing with impossible choices. He was nobody. A black janitor who couldn't afford a lawyer, going up against one of the most powerful families in America. Who would believe him? Randy Grant had money, connections, and an army of attorneys. Jamal had nothing but a stolen vial and a story that sounded insane. If he spoke up, he would be destroyed. He would lose his job, probably face criminal charges for trespassing or theft. Rachel would lose her father just like she had lost her mother. Everything he had worked to build would crumble. But if he stayed silent, a man would die. Not just die, but be buried alive, conscious of the darkness closing in around him as his oxygen slowly ran out. It was a fate worse than death, and Jamal would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. Back in his apartment, he had stared at his wife's photograph on the nightstand. Sarah had been the best person he had ever known, kind, brave, and unwavering in her moral compass. She had always told him the same thing whenever he faced a difficult decision. Do the right thing, Jamal, even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. Then another memory had surfaced, one he had buried for nearly 2 decades. During his time in the Army, he had witnessed a commanding officer make a fatal error during a medical procedure. Jamal had known something was wrong, had felt it in his gut, but he had stayed silent, too afraid of the consequences of speaking up against a superior. His fellow soldier had died that night, and Jamal had never forgiven himself. He had looked at the vial in his hand, then back at Sarah's photograph. I can't do it again, he had whispered to her image. I can't stay silent and let another man die. Now, standing at the edge of the funeral, Jamal watched as the pallbearers prepared to lower the coffin into the ground. In minutes, Elias Grant would be buried 6 feet under, and no one would ever know the truth. Jamal thought of Rachel, of everything she would lose if he did this. He thought of his job, his freedom, his reputation. He thought of all the reasons to stay quiet, to walk away, to pretend he had never heard anything. Then he thought of a man suffocating in darkness, betrayed by his own son. And he ran. The security guards tackled him within seconds, but not before he had screamed the words that would change everything. Now, pinned to the ground with his arms wrenched behind his back, Jamal could see the chaos he had unleashed. Randy Grant's face had gone pale. Dr. Shaw clutched his medical bag with white-knuckled hands. The crowd buzzed with confusion and outrage. "Get this lunatic out of here!" Randy shouted, his composure cracking. "He's obviously mentally disturbed." Dr. Shaw stepped forward, his voice calm and authoritative. "I am the physician who examined Mr. Grant. I personally signed his death certificate. This man is clearly deranged." The guards began dragging Jamal away. He struggled against their grip, desperation flooding his voice. "Check him. Just check his body. You'll see the signs of life." Most of the crowd looked at him with pity or disgust. But not everyone. A young woman with sharp eyes and a press badge pushed her way to the front. Her name was Claire Mitchell, an investigative reporter for a local television station. She had come to cover the funeral of a tech legend, but her instincts told her she had stumbled onto something much bigger. "Wait!" Claire called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "What if he's telling the truth? We're about to bury a man. Shouldn't we at least verify?" An elderly man in an expensive suit stood up from the front row. Harold Bennett had been Elias Grant's personal attorney and closest friend for over 30 years. His face was lined with grief, but his eyes were sharp with suspicion. "Randy," Harold said slowly, "if you have nothing to hide, why not allow a simple examination? It would take only moments to prove this man wrong." Randy's jaw tightened. He was trapped. If he refused, he would look guilty. If he agreed, everything could unravel. "Fine," he spat. "Open the coffin. Let everyone see what a fool this janitor is." The pallbearers exchanged uncertain glances before lifting the lid. Inside, Elias Grant lay motionless, his skin waxy and gray. He showed no signs of breathing, no flutter of pulse in his neck. To every appearance, he was completely dead. Dr. Shaw pressed 2 fingers to Elias's wrist and shook his head. "No pulse, no respiration. This man has been dead for 3 days." He turned to the crowd with a practiced expression of sympathy. "I understand grief can make people desperate for miracles, but there is no miracle here." The guards tightened their grip on Jamal's arms. The crowd began to turn away, murmuring about the sad spectacle they had witnessed. But Jamal was not finished. "Give me 60 seconds, he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. 60 seconds. If I'm wrong, you can arrest me, lock me up, do whatever you want. But if I'm right, you'll have saved a man's life." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small glass vial. Randy's eyes went wide. He recognized it immediately. "Where did you get that?" Randy demanded, lunging forward before catching himself. "That's evidence. He stole something from the mortuary." "Evidence of what?" Claire asked, her camera already rolling. "You just said this was a deranged janitor making up stories. What exactly would he have stolen?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Randy's face. The crowd had stopped dispersing. All eyes were on the vial in Jamal's trembling hand. 60 seconds, Jamal repeated. "That's all I'm asking for. 60 seconds to prove that Elias Grant is still alive." The tension in the air was suffocating. Every eye at the funeral was fixed on the small glass vial in Jamal's hand, its contents catching the afternoon sunlight like liquid crystal. Randy recovered quickly, forcing his features back into a mask of grieving sun. "This is absurd. We're not going to let some delusional janitor desecrate my father's body with God knows what." He turned to the security guards. "Remove him. Now." The guards moved to drag Jamal away, but Harold Bennett stepped forward, blocking their path. The elderly attorney's voice carried the weight of 30 years of courtroom battles. "I've known Elias Grant since before you were born, Randy, and I've never seen you this afraid of a simple test." Harold's eyes narrowed. "If that vial contains nothing but water, what exactly are you worried about?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Claire Mitchell pushed closer, her camera capturing every moment. Other journalists, sensing blood in the water, began pressing forward as well. Randy glanced at Dr. Shaw, a silent communication passing between them. The doctor stepped forward, his demeanor radiating professional authority. "As the physician of record, I must object to this circus. Allowing an untrained individual to administer an unknown substance to a corpse is not only pointless, but potentially illegal. This man could be trying to poison the body to cover up evidence of his own crimes." It was a clever deflection, and for a moment, it seemed to work. Several members of the crowd nodded in agreement. The guards tightened their grip on Jamal's arms, but Claire was not convinced. "Then have a medical professional administer it," she called out. "There are dozens of doctors here. Let one of them verify what's in that vial and give it to Mr. Grant." Dr. Shaw's composure flickered. "That's completely unnecessary. The man is dead. I examined him myself." "Then you have nothing to worry about." Harold crossed his arms. "Unless your examination was somehow flawed." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Dr. Shaw's face reddened, but before he could respond, a voice rang out from the crowd. "I'll do it." A woman in her 50s stepped forward. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Coleman, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Stanford Medical Center. She had come to pay her respects to Elias Grant, who had donated millions to her hospital over the years. "Give me the vial," Dr. Coleman said to Jamal. "I'll examine its contents and administer it under proper medical supervision. If this man is truly dead, no harm will be done. But if there's even a chance he's alive, we have an obligation to find out." Randy opened his mouth to protest, but the crowd had shifted. Too many people were watching. Too many cameras were rolling. To refuse now would be an admission of guilt. "Fine," Randy said through gritted teeth. "But when this charade is over, I want this man arrested for disturbing the peace and desecrating a funeral." The guards released Jamal, who stumbled forward on unsteady legs. He handed the vial to Dr. Coleman, his eyes meeting hers. "3 drops," he said quietly. "On the tongue. That's what I heard them say." Dr. Coleman examined the vial carefully, noting the handwritten label. Her expression grew serious. "Tetrodotoxin antidote," she read aloud. "This is used to counteract pufferfish poisoning. It's extremely rare and extremely specific." She looked at Jamal with new respect. "Where did you get this?" "It fell from his pocket." Jamal pointed at Dr. Shaw. "Last night, when he and Randy were discussing how long it would take for Mr. Grant to die." Dr. Shaw laughed, but the sound was brittle. "This is slander. I'll have you sued for every penny you don't have." "Then prove him wrong," Harold said simply. "Let the doctor administer the antidote." There was nowhere left to hide. With the eyes of the world watching, Dr. Coleman leaned over the coffin and carefully placed 3 drops of the clear liquid on Elias Grant's tongue. The crowd held its collective breath. 10 seconds passed. Nothing happened. 20 seconds. Elias lay motionless, his face as pale and still as marble. 30 seconds. Dr. Shaw allowed himself a small smile. "As I said, the man is dead. This has been a waste of everyone's time and an insult to a great man's memory." Randy nodded vigorously. "I want that janitor in handcuffs immediately." But Jamal's eyes never left the coffin. He had seen something, a movement so subtle that anyone else would have missed it. A tiny twitch in Elias's right hand, barely perceptible, like a leaf stirring in a breath of wind. "Wait!" Jamal whispered. "Look at his hand!" 40 seconds had passed. The twitch came again, stronger this time. Then Elias's fingers curled inward, grasping weakly at the silk lining of the coffin. A woman in the front row screamed. 50 seconds. Elias's chest rose with a shallow, shuddering breath. His eyelids fluttered, revealing a sliver of white beneath. Dr. Coleman pressed her fingers to his neck, her professional calm cracking with disbelief. "There's a pulse! My God, there's actually a pulse!" 60 seconds. Elias Grant coughed, a weak, rattling sound that echoed across the cemetery like a thunderclap. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused and confused, struggling to make sense of the hundreds of faces staring down at him. The crowd erupted. People screamed, cried, and pushed forward to see the miracle for themselves. Camera flashes exploded like lightning, capturing the moment when a billionaire came back from the dead. "He's alive!" someone shouted. "Elias Grant is alive!" Jamal sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He had done it. Against all odds, against every voice telling him to stay silent, he had done the right thing. But not everyone was celebrating. Randy Grant stood frozen, his face drained of all color. 20 years of resentment, 6 months of careful planning, and everything was crumbling before his eyes. The inheritance, the company, the power he had murdered for was slipping through his fingers. He looked at Dr. Shaw, desperation burning in his gaze. The doctor had gone pale as well, his hands trembling as he clutched his medical bag. Inside that bag was a backup syringe filled with concentrated tetrodotoxin, enough to finish the job if anything went wrong. Something had gone very wrong. In the chaos, no one noticed Randy moving closer to Dr. Shaw. No one saw the silent exchange, the quick handoff of the syringe from bag to palm. Everyone was too focused on the impossible sight of Elias Grant sitting up in his own coffin, gasping for air like a man rescued from drowning. Dr. Coleman was shouting for someone to call an ambulance. Harold Bennett had tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Claire Mitchell was narrating into her microphone, her voice cracking with emotion. And Randy was pushing through the crowd with murder in his eyes. Jamal saw him first. Something about the way Randy moved, the rigid set of his shoulders, the fixed intensity of his stare. It was the look of a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. Then Jamal saw the syringe in Randy's hand. "No!" Jamal screamed, launching himself forward. Randy had reached the coffin. Elias looked up at his son with confusion and dawning recognition, too weak to understand the danger he was in. "Randy?" Elias's voice was barely a whisper. "What's happening? Where am I?" "You should have stayed dead," Randy hissed, raising the syringe. "This time I'll make sure of it." He brought the needle down toward his father's chest. Jamal collided with Randy at full speed, knocking him sideways. The syringe flew from Randy's grip, tumbling through the air before clattering against the side of the coffin. The two men crashed to the ground, fists swinging wildly. Randy was younger and stronger, fueled by desperation and rage. He landed a vicious punch to Jamal's ribs, then another to his face. Jamal tasted blood but refused to let go. "Get off me!" Randy screamed, scrambling for the fallen syringe. His fingers closed around it just as Jamal grabbed his wrist. They struggled for control, the needle inches from Jamal's neck. Randy was winning, slowly forcing the syringe closer and closer. "You stupid old man," Randy snarled. "You could have walked away. You could have minded your own business and lived your pathetic little life. Now you're going to die with my father." With a final burst of strength, Randy wrenched his arm free and plunged the syringe into Jamal's shoulder. Jamal felt the needle pierce his skin, felt the cold burn of the poison entering his bloodstream. His grip on Randy loosened as his muscles began to seize. But before Randy could celebrate his victory, a heavy object struck the back of his head. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Harold Bennett stood over him, clutching a marble ceremonial urn. The old lawyer's hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. "That's for trying to kill my best friend, you miserable bastard." Security guards swarmed in, pinning Randy to the ground and wrenching the empty syringe from his limp hand. Dr. Shaw tried to slip away through the crowd, but Claire Mitchell and several other journalists blocked his path until police arrived. But Jamal barely noticed any of it. His vision was blurring, his heartbeat slowing to a crawl. The tetrodotoxin was doing its work, shutting down his nervous system one function at a time. He collapsed beside the coffin, his body convulsing. The world seemed to be retreating, growing distant and muffled, like he was sinking into deep water. From somewhere far away, he heard voices shouting. Dr. Coleman's face swam into view, her hands pressing against his chest. "The antidote!" she screamed. "Is there any left?" Someone retrieved the vial, holding it up to the light. A few precious drops remained at the bottom, just enough for one more dose. "It's not enough," Dr. Coleman said, her voice breaking. "There's barely anything left." "Use it." The voice was weak, but unmistakable. Elias Grant had pulled himself to the edge of the coffin, his face ashen, but his eyes clear. "Save him," Elias commanded. "That man just sacrificed his life for mine. Save him." Dr. Coleman didn't hesitate. She tilted Jamal's head back and let the remaining drops fall onto his tongue. The seconds stretched into eternity. Jamal lay motionless, his chest barely rising. Dr. Coleman checked for a pulse and found it fading, weakening with each beat. Then, just when all hope seemed lost, Jamal took a deep, shuddering breath. His eyes fluttered open. He was alive. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted in cheers. Strangers embraced each other, weeping with relief and amazement. In the span of 10 minutes, they had witnessed 2 men return from the brink of death. Randy was hauled to his feet in handcuffs, his face twisted with impotent rage. Dr. Shaw stood nearby, also restrained, his professional dignity stripped away to reveal the coward beneath. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Ambulances were on their way. The biggest story of the decade was being broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world. But in the center of the chaos, there was a moment of stillness. Elias Grant looked down at the man who had saved his life. Jamal Turner looked up at the man he had refused to let die. They were strangers from opposite ends of the world. One had built an empire worth billions. The other couldn't afford to fix the leak in his apartment ceiling. By every measure of society, they had nothing in common. But in that moment, none of that mattered. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice raw with emotion. Jamal tried to smile, though his face was swollen and bloody. "Nobody important. Just the janitor." Elias reached down and grasped Jamal's hand. "You saved my life. You risked everything for a stranger. That makes you the most important person here." Jamal shook his head weakly. "I just did what was right, what my wife would have wanted me to do." The ambulances arrived and paramedics rushed forward to treat both men. As they lifted Jamal onto a stretcher, he caught one last glimpse of Randy being led away in handcuffs. The man who had tried to murder his own father was finally going to face justice. The conspiracy that had nearly claimed 2 lives had been exposed before the entire world. And Jamal Turner, a janitor who had spent years being invisible, had become the most unlikely hero in American history. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens began to wail, Jamal allowed himself to close his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. He had done the right thing, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. Sarah would have been proud. 2 weeks had passed since the funeral that shocked the world. Jamal Turner opened his eyes to find himself in a hospital room flooded with afternoon sunlight. For a moment, he had no idea where he was or how he had gotten there. Then the memories came rushing back. The coffin, the syringe, the feeling of poison spreading through his veins. He tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. Every muscle ached, and his shoulder throbbed where the needle had pierced his skin. "Dad?" The voice came from beside him. Jamal turned his head and saw Rachel sitting in a plastic chair, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Rachel." His voice came out as a croak. "How long?" "Almost 2 weeks." Rachel grabbed his hand and held it tight. "You were in a coma. The doctor said the poison nearly killed you. They weren't sure you'd ever wake up." Her voice broke. "I thought I was going to lose you too." Jamal squeezed her hand weakly. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I scared you." "Don't apologize." Rachel wiped her tears with her free hand. "What you did was incredible. The whole world is talking about it. You're a hero, Dad." A hero. Jamal had never thought of himself that way. He was just a man who couldn't live with the alternative. Over the next few hours, the doctors came and went, checking his vitals and marveling at his recovery. The tetrodotoxin had come dangerously close to killing him. If Dr. Coleman hadn't administered the remaining antidote when she did, he would have suffered permanent brain damage or worse. The next morning, Jamal had an unexpected visitor. Elias Grant walked into the room slowly, leaning on a cane for support. He looked thinner than he had at the funeral, his face drawn and pale. But his eyes were alive with an intensity that no amount of poison could extinguish. "Mr. Turner," Elias said, lowering himself into the chair Rachel had vacated. "I've been wanting to meet you properly since the moment I woke up in that coffin." Jamal tried to sit up straighter but winced at the pain. "You shouldn't be out of bed, Mr. Grant. You were poisoned too." "I've spent the last 2 weeks in intensive care, being poked and prodded by every specialist in California." Elias waved dismissively. "I needed to get out of there before I lost my mind." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. Finally, Elias spoke. "You didn't know me. You had no reason to risk your life for a stranger. Why did you do it?" Jamal thought about the question carefully. He thought about Sarah, about his years in the army, about the soldier he had failed to save so many years ago. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said at last. "And because I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent again." Elias studied him for a long moment. "My own son tried to murder me for money. A man I raised, provided for, gave every advantage in life. And a stranger, a man who cleans floors for a living, risked everything to save me." He shook his head slowly. "How does that make any sense?" "Maybe it doesn't have to make sense." Jamal met his gaze. "Maybe some things just are what they are." Elias was quiet for a while. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "You gave me a second chance, Mr. Turner. I won't waste it. The investigation into Randy Grant and Dr. Vincent Shaw consumed the national news for weeks. FBI agents and local police worked together to piece together the conspiracy, aided by a mountain of evidence that the conspirators had been too arrogant to destroy. Emails between Randy and Dr. Shaw revealed that they had been planning the murder for 6 months, ever since Elias had announced his intention to change his will. Phone records showed dozens of calls between them in the days leading up to the poisoning. And when faced with the prospect of life in prison, Dr. Shaw agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony laid bare every detail of the plot. The tetrodotoxin had been sourced from a contact in Japan, smuggled into the country through one of Randy's business connections. Dr. Shaw had administered the poison during a routine medical checkup at Elias's home, disguising it as a vitamin injection. When Elias had collapsed, Dr. Shaw had been right there to declare him dead and sign the death certificate. It had been a perfect crime. Or it would have been, if not for a janitor who happened to be working late. 1 month after the funeral, the trial began. The courthouse was surrounded by media from around the world. Reporters jostled for position on the steps while helicopters circled overhead. Inside, every seat in the gallery was filled with spectators eager to witness the conclusion of the most sensational case in recent memory. Jamal sat in the witness box, wearing a suit that Elias had insisted on buying for him. He felt uncomfortable in the expensive fabric, out of place in this world of lawyers and judges and television cameras. But he had a job to do. The prosecutor led him through his testimony methodically. Jamal described what he had witnessed in the mortuary, the conversation between Randy and Dr. Shaw, the discovery of the antidote, his decision to speak up at the funeral. When he finished, Randy's defense attorney rose to cross-examine him. The lawyer was a silver-haired man in a $3,000 suit, and he approached the witness box with the confidence of someone who had destroyed countless testimonies before. "Mr. Turner," the attorney began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you work as a janitor at Greenwood Memorial Cemetery, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And what is your educational background? Do you have any medical training?" Jamal sat up straighter. "I served as a combat medic in the United States Army for 8 years. I've treated gunshot wounds, performed emergency surgeries in the field, and saved more lives than I can count." The attorney's smile faltered slightly. "I see. And yet, despite this medical training, you've spent years mopping floors and emptying trash cans. Why is that?" "Because life doesn't always turn out the way you plan." Jamal's voice was steady. "I came home from war with wounds that don't show on the outside. I struggled. I fell. But I never stopped trying to be a good man." The gallery was silent. Several jury members nodded with respect. The attorney tried a different approach. "Mr. Turner, isn't it possible that you misheard the conversation you claim to have witnessed, that you were mistaken about what was happening?" "No, sir." "How can you be so certain?" Jamal looked directly at Randy, who sat at the defense table with cold hatred in his eyes. "Because I heard Randy Grant say, and I quote, 'The old man was planning to change his will. He was going to leave me with scraps. Now Grant Technologies will finally be mine.' Those aren't the words of a loving son. Those are the words of a murderer." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge called for order. When Elias took the stand, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He walked slowly to the witness box, still recovering from the effects of the poison, and raised his right hand to be sworn in. The prosecutor asked him to describe his relationship with his son. Elias spoke carefully, weighing each word. "I loved Randy. I gave him everything I thought he needed, the best education, opportunities most people could only dream of, a path to inheriting one of the largest companies in the world. But I realize now that I failed him in the ways that mattered most. I was too busy building an empire to build a relationship with my own child." He turned to look at Randy directly. "That doesn't excuse what you did. You tried to murder me for money. You would have buried me alive and gone on with your life as if nothing had happened." His voice cracked. "I will never understand how you could do that to your own father." Randy stared back at him with no trace of remorse. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Randy Grant was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and fraud. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. Dr. Vincent Shaw, who had cooperated with the prosecution, received 15 years for his role in the conspiracy and the violation of his medical oath. As Randy was led away in handcuffs, he turned to look at his father one last time. His eyes burned with fury, but Elias only met his gaze with profound sadness. He had lost his son long before the trial, perhaps long before the poison. He just hadn't realized it until now. 3 months later, the world had moved on to other scandals and sensations. But for Jamal Turner, life would never be the same. The media had crowned him a hero, the humble janitor who had saved a billionaire from being buried alive. His face had been on every news channel, every magazine cover, every social media feed. Strangers stopped him on the street to shake his hand or ask for selfies. Companies offered him endorsement deals worth more money than he had ever seen. He turned them all down. When Elias offered him $10 million as a thank you gift, Jamal refused that too. "I didn't do it for money," Jamal said when they met in Elias's hospital room during one of his final checkups. "And I won't take payment for doing what any decent person should have done." Elias shook his head in amazement. "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met." "I've been called worse." "Then let me do something else." Elias leaned forward. "If you won't accept money for yourself, let me use my resources to help people like you. Veterans who are struggling to find their place in civilian life. People who have been overlooked and forgotten by a society that should have done better by them." Jamal considered this for a long moment. "What did you have in mind?" And so the Jamal Turner Foundation was born. Funded by Elias Grant's fortune, it would provide education, job training, and support services for veterans and underserved communities across the country. The first scholarship it awarded went to Rachel Turner, a full ride to study medicine at Stanford University. Jamal himself was offered a position as Director of Community Programs at the Grant Foundation. It was real work, meaningful work, not charity or pity. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond mere survival. Elias, meanwhile, set about rebuilding his life. He executed the will that Randy had tried to prevent, donating 80% of his fortune to charitable causes. Schools would be built, hospitals funded, research programs launched. The Grant name would be remembered not for the betrayal of a son, but for the generosity of a father given a second chance. 6 months after the funeral, the first school funded by the Grant Foundation held its grand opening ceremony. It was located in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Oakland, a place where children grew up with more obstacles than opportunities. But now they would have a state-of-the-art facility with modern classrooms, computer labs, and teachers who actually had the resources they needed. Jamal and Elias stood together on the stage, scissors in hand, ready to cut the ceremonial ribbon. Hundreds of children and parents filled the courtyard, their faces bright with hope and excitement. "Ready?" Elias asked. "Ready," Jamal replied. They cut the ribbon together, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Afterward, as the celebration continued around them, the two men found themselves sitting alone on a bench at the edge of the school grounds. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "You know," Elias said, "I used to think I had everything. Money, power, influence. I could buy anything I wanted, go anywhere I pleased, make things happen with a single phone call." He looked down at his hands. "But when I was lying in that coffin, none of it mattered. I was completely alone." Jamal nodded slowly. "I've spent most of my life on the other end of that. Never had money, never had power. Some days I could barely afford to keep the lights on." He thought of Sarah, of all the years they had struggled together. "But I had my wife. I have my daughter. And I have something money can't buy." "What's that?" "Peace." Jamal met his eyes. "The peace that comes from looking in the mirror every morning and knowing you've tried to be a good man. That's worth more than all the billions in the world." Elias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "You taught me that, Jamal. In one act of courage, you taught me more about what matters in life than 68 years of success ever did." Jamal shook his head. "I didn't teach you anything. You just needed someone to remind you of what you already knew." The two men sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent. Around them, children laughed and played, their voices full of joy and possibility. It was the sound of hope, of futures being rewritten, of second chances being given to those who needed them most. They came from different worlds, these two men. One had built an empire worth billions. The other had spent years being invisible to the very society that now celebrated him as a hero. By every measure that mattered to the world, they had nothing in common. But sitting there on that bench, watching the sun set over a school that would change countless lives, they were simply two friends who had saved each other in ways neither could have predicted. Elias turned to Jamal with a slight smile. Same time next week? I hear they're breaking ground on the second school in Detroit. Jamal returned the smile. I'll be there. And as the last rays of sunlight faded into twilight, the billionaire and the janitor sat together in the quiet peace of an ending that was really just a beginning. Sometimes the people with nothing are the ones who give us everything,